The millionaire's son wasn't deaf, and only the maid noticed. In the sprawling Georgian mansion overlooking Savannah's historic district, where Spanish moss whispered secrets through wrought iron gates, a deception had been unraveling for 7 long years. 7 years of silence. 7 years of lies. 7 years of a family living in the shadow of what they believed was their greatest tragedy. Hi, I'm John Parker, and today's story will touch your heart. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, give your like, it means so much to me, and leave in the comments which city or country you are listening from. The truth began to surface on a rain-soaked Thursday morning in March, when Carmen Valdez was polishing the antique mahogany furniture in the Whitmore family's private library. At 52, Carmen had seen enough in her 2 decades of service to wealthy families to recognize when something wasn't quite right. But what she discovered that morning would shatter everything the Whitmore family believed about their lives. 17-year-old. Ethan Whitmore sat in his usual spot by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his back turned to the world, supposedly lost in his silent realm. His father, Richard Whitmore, a real estate magnate worth $300 million, had built an empire on the foundation of his son's disability. The Whitmore Foundation for Deaf Children had become his redemption, his way of channeling grief into purpose. His wife, Victoria, had transformed from Charleston's most sought-after socialite into a devoted advocate, learning sign language, hosting charity galas, and speaking at conferences about raising a deaf child in a hearing world. But Carmen noticed what others had missed. She noticed how Ethan's shoulders tensed when his parents argued behind closed doors. She noticed how his breathing changed when the housekeeper, Mrs. Patterson, gossiped on the phone about family secrets. She thought, no one could hear. Most telling of all, she noticed how Ethan's fingers would tap against his leg, not randomly, but in perfect rhythm to the classical music that drifted through the house's sound system. The morning that changed everything started like any other. Carmen was dusting the crystal chess set that Richard had given Ethan for his 16th birthday, a beautiful but seemingly useless gift for someone who couldn't hear the pieces move across the board. As she worked, she hummed an old lullaby her grandmother had sung to her in their small village outside Guadalajara. It was barely audible, a melody that seemed to float on the morning air like incense. That, quote, S when she saw it, Ethan's head turned, just slightly, just enough to catch the melody. His lips began to move, silently forming the words to a song he should never have known. Carmen's hand froze on the crystal bishop, her heart hammering against her ribs. In that moment, she realized she was looking at the greatest deception she had ever witnessed. The weight of discovery pressed down on her shoulders like the humid Savannah air. She thought about the medical bills, hundreds of thousands of dollars spent on specialists, treatments, and experimental procedures. She thought about the foundation that bore the family name, the millions of dollars raised for deaf children across the country. She thought about Victoria's tear-filled speeches at charity dinners, Richard's passionate advocacy in boardrooms, and the way the entire family had reorganized their lives around what they believed was Ethan's disability. But most of all, she thought about Ethan himself, a young man who had somehow convinced the world, including his own parents, that he lived in perpetual silence. What kind of pain could drive a child to such an elaborate deception? What kind of secret was worth 7 years of stolen words, missed conversations, and a family's broken heart? As Carmen stood there in the morning light, she realized that she held in her hands not just a terrible secret, but the power to either preserve a family's carefully constructed world or watch it crumble into a million pieces. The question that haunted her as she resumed her dusting wasn't whether Ethan could hear. She now knew with certainty that he could. The question was why a 10-year-old child had chosen silence, and whether the truth, after 7 years of lies, would heal the Whitmore family or destroy them completely. Dot, the grandfather clock in the hallway, chimed 9 times, its bronze bells resonating through the mansion's corridors, and Carmen watched as Ethan's eyes closed briefly, not in the way someone might feel vibrations, but in the way someone might savor a familiar, comforting sound. She knew then that her life and the lives of everyone in that house was about to change forever. But what Carmen didn't know yet was that Ethan's deception was just the beginning of a web of secrets that ran deeper than anyone could imagine, and that the truth she had stumbled upon would unlock a mystery that had been 7 years in the making. A mystery that would reveal not just why Ethan had chosen silence, but what had driven him to it in the first place. The memories came flooding. Back to Carmen as she moved through the mansion that afternoon, each room holding pieces of a puzzle she was only now beginning to understand. She remembered the day she had started working for the Whitmores 7 years ago, when Ethan was still a chattering 10-year-old who would follow her around the house, asking endless questions about her life in Mexico and begging her to teach him Spanish words. ¿Cómo se dice happy in español, Carmen? He would ask, his bright green eyes sparkling with curiosity. Feliz, mijo, she would answer, not knowing that within weeks those same eyes would grow distant, and that voice would fall silent forever. The official story had been carved into the family's history, like words on a gravestone. Ethan had been riding his bicycle through Forsyth Park on a sunny April morning when a delivery truck ran a red light. The impact had thrown him 15 feet, leaving him unconscious for 3 days. When he finally opened his eyes in the children's intensive care unit at Memorial Health, the doctors delivered devastating news. Severe trauma to the auditory cortex had left him completely deaf. Richard had raged against the medical team, demanding second opinions, experimental treatments, anything that might restore his son's hearing. Victoria had collapsed in the hospital chapel, her sobs echoing off the stained glass windows as she bargained with God for a miracle that would never come. But Carmen remembered something the family had forgotten in their grief: Ethan's behavior. In those first weeks after the accident had been more than just adjustment to deafness. He had been terrified. Not confused or frustrated like a child suddenly thrust into a silent world, but terrified in a way that suggested he was hiding from something far more dangerous than the loss of his hearing. She remembered finding him one night, 3 months after the accident, crouched behind his bedroom door with tears streaming down his face, watching the hallway as if expecting someone to appear. When she had tried to comfort him, he had pressed his finger to his lips and pointed toward his parents' bedroom, where angry voices were carrying through the walls. The fight that night had been particularly vicious. Richard's voice had boomed through the mansion as he accused Victoria of not watching their son closely enough. If you had been paying attention instead of planning your goddamn charity luncheon, our boy would still be able to hear. Victoria's response had been equally cutting. Don't you dare blame me for your failures as a father. You were too busy building your empire to notice your own son was unhappy. The argument had gone on for hours, filled with accusations about affairs, money, and the slow dissolution of their marriage under the weight of their son's condition. What Carmen had never understood until now was why Ethan, who supposedly couldn't hear any of it, had looked so devastated by his parents' fight. She had chalked it up to a child's intuition, the way children can sense tension even without understanding its source. But now she realized the horrible truth. Ethan had heard every word, every cruel accusation, every moment of blame, every time his condition had been used as a weapon in their crumbling marriage. The pattern became clearer as Carmen reflected on 7 years of subtle observations. There was the way Ethan would flinch when doors slammed, even when his back was turned. The way he would sign bathroom to his parents, but walk directly to whichever bathroom he needed without the spatial confusion that should have affected. Someone who couldn't hear the household's acoustic landmarks. Most damning of all, there was his uncanny ability to appear in rooms just before his parents started arguing, as if he could sense the tension building in their voices. As the afternoon sun slanted through the plantation shutters, Carmen found herself in the kitchen with Mrs. Patterson, the housekeeper who had been with the family even longer than Carmen herself. Eleanor Patterson was a formidable woman in her 60s who had raised 4 children of her own and had strong opinions about everything from proper table settings to child rearing. She was also one of the few people who had worked in the house before Ethan's accident. "Mrs. Patterson," Carmen said carefully, "do you ever think about how different Ethan was before the accident?" Eleanor looked up from the vegetable soup she was preparing, her steel-grey eyes studying Carmen's face. "Different how, dear?" she asked, though something in her expression suggested she had been waiting for this conversation for years. Carmen chose her words carefully. "He was such a talkative child, always singing, always laughing, and now—" She let the sentence hang in the air like morning mist. Eleanor set down her wooden spoon and leaned against the marble countertop. "You know, Carmen, I've been thinking about that boy for 7 years, thinking about things that don't quite add up." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Like how he always knows when the timer on the oven goes off, even when he's supposedly not looking. Or how he never walks into the music room when Mr. Richard is playing piano, even though sound shouldn't matter to him anymore." The 2 women looked at each other across the kitchen island, both carrying the weight of suspicions they had never dared voice. Finally, Eleanor spoke the words that Carmen had been afraid to say. "What if that boy isn't as deaf as everyone thinks he is?" The question hung between them like a live wire, dangerous and electric with possibility. Carmen felt her heart racing as she realized she wasn't alone in her discovery. What if he's been protecting himself from something we don't understand? That evening, as the Whitmore family gathered for dinner in their formal dining room, a ritual they maintained despite the complicated dynamics of communicating with their supposedly deaf son, Carmen watched from the kitchen doorway as Ethan navigated the meal with the skill of someone who had been perfecting his performance for years. He responded to his parents' signing with appropriate timing, never too quick, never too slow. He seemed to feel the vibrations of his water glass when someone walked heavily across the hardwood floor. He smiled at the right moments and looked confused when his parents deliberately signed something nonsensical to test his comprehension. But Carmen saw what others missed, the microsecond delay before each response, the way his eyes darted to his parents' faces to read their expressions before he signed back, and most tellingly, the way he held his breath whenever Richard's voice rose in frustration. These were not the behaviors of someone living in silence. These were the behaviors of someone who had become a master of deception, someone who had spent 7 years perfecting the art of hiding in plain sight. As she watched this elaborate performance unfold, Carmen realized that she was witnessing something far more complex than simple deception. She was watching a family destroy itself with love, sacrifice, and the weight of a secret that none of them fully understood. The question that haunted her as she cleared the dinner dishes wasn't just why Ethan had chosen this path, but whether revealing the truth would save them all or complete their destruction. The breakthrough came 3 days later, in the most unexpected place, the mansion's dusty attic, where Carmen had gone to retrieve Christmas decorations that Victoria wanted donated to the church auction. Among the carefully labeled boxes and forgotten furniture, she discovered something that made her blood run cold. A collection of audio recordings hidden inside an old jewelry box that belonged to Ethan's late grandmother, The recordings were on an ancient cassette player. the kind that hadn't been used in decades. As Carmen pressed play with trembling fingers, she heard a voice she barely recognized. Young Ethan, probably around 9 years old, whispering into the microphone with the secretive excitement of a child keeping a diary. Day 15, his small voice crackled through the static. I heard Daddy talking on the phone again last night. He was angry, really angry. He kept saying something about loose ends and making sure nobody talks. I don't understand what it means, but Mommy was crying after he hung up. Carmen's hands shook as she fast-forwarded through weeks of entries. Each recording painted a picture of a household in crisis that the adults thought they were hiding from their observant son. Ethan had been documenting everything. Phone calls, in the middle of the night, hushed conversations behind closed doors, the comings and goings of strange men in expensive suits who claimed to be business associates, but left his parents looking pale and frightened. Day 23, another entry revealed. The man with the scar came back today. Daddy gave him a big envelope, and the man said something about insurance and keeping everyone safe. When he left, Mommy hugged me really tight and told me I was the most important thing in the world to her. Why does she look so scared when she says it? The final recording was dated just 2 days before Ethan's accident, and his voice carried a maturity that no 9-year-old should possess. I think something bad is going to happen, he whispered. I heard Daddy on the phone saying that the kid knows too much, and that they need to handle the situation before it gets out of hand. I don't know what I know that's so bad, but I'm scared. Really scared. Maybe if I pretend I can't hear anything anymore, they'll leave me alone. Maybe if I can't hear their secrets, I won't be in danger. Carmen sat in the attic's golden afternoon light, tears streaming down her face as the terrible truth crystallized. Ethan hadn't lost his hearing in an accident. He had chosen deafness as his shield, his protection from a world that had become too dangerous for a little boy who heard too much. The bicycle accident had been real, but it had also been his salvation, providing the perfect cover for a child who needed to disappear into silence to survive. The pieces began falling into place like dominoes in her mind. Richard Whitmore's real estate empire hadn't been built on legitimate deals alone. Those late-night meetings, those mysterious envelopes, those men with scars and cold eyes, they painted a picture of a millionaire who had entangled himself with people who didn't accept failure or exposure. When young Ethan had inadvertently learned too much about his father's dangerous associations, his very existence had become a liability. But children are remarkably adaptable creatures, and Ethan had found a solution that a desperate 9-year-old mind could conceive. If he couldn't hear, he couldn't be a witness. If he couldn't testify to conversations he'd never officially heard, he couldn't be a threat. The accident had given him the perfect opportunity to retreat into a protective silence that had saved his life, but condemned his family to 7 years of unnecessary heartbreak. Carmen realized that Richard and Victoria's guilt wasn't just about failing to protect their son from a traffic accident. It was about the relief they felt when their deaf child could no longer overhear the conversations that had put him in danger. Subconsciously, they knew that Ethan's condition had solved a problem they couldn't face directly. Their excessive devotion to deaf children's causes wasn't just about honoring their son's struggle, it was about atoning for the secret relief they felt at his silence. As she carefully replaced the cassette player in the jewelry box, Carmen heard footsteps on the attic stairs. Her heart hammered as Ethan appeared at the top of the stairs, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who supposedly couldn't hear approaching footsteps. But when their eyes met, she saw something in his gaze that took her breath away. Recognition. He knew that she knew. For a long moment, they stared at each other across the dusty attic space, 17 years of deception hanging between them like a bridge neither dared cross. Finally, Ethan did something he hadn't done in 7 years. He spoke. his voice rusty from disuse but clear and intelligent. "You found my recordings," he said simply, and Carmen heard in those 4 words the weight of a childhood stolen and a young man who had grown up too fast in the shadows of adult secrets. "Mijo," Carmen whispered, using the Spanish endearment she had called him as a child. "Why didn't you tell them? Why didn't you let them know you were safe?" Ethan's eyes filled with tears as he moved closer, his movements now fluid and natural, without the careful performance he maintained downstairs. "Because I wasn't safe, Carmen. I'm still not safe. The men who scared my father, they're still out there. And if they ever find out that the witness they thought was neutralized can actually hear everything." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Carmen understood then that she was looking at a young man who had sacrificed his childhood, his relationship with his parents, and 7 years of his life to protect not just himself, but his entire family. His silence hadn't been cowardice. It had been the most courageous act imaginable from a child who understood that sometimes love means letting the people you care about believe a lie that keeps them safe. "But your parents," Carmen said softly, "they blame themselves. They're destroying their marriage over guilt that isn't even real." Ethan's face crumpled, and she saw in that moment the little boy he had never been allowed to be. "I know," he whispered. "I see it every day. But if I tell them the truth now, after 7 years of foundation work, charity events and public advocacy, if they find out I chose this, that their grief was for nothing." He shook his head. "It would destroy them anyway, Carmen. Either way, I destroy my family." Standing there in the attic, where his grandmother's jewelry box had held the secrets of a frightened child, Carmen realized that she had stumbled into the most complex web of love, sacrifice, and protection she had ever encountered. The question now wasn't just whether to reveal Ethan's secret, it was whether a family built on lies could survive the weight of truth, or whether some secrets are too dangerous to ever see the light. The catalyst for change arrived on a Tuesday morning in the form of Detective Marcus Webb from the Chatham County Sheriff's Department. Carmen watched from the kitchen window as his unmarked sedan pulled through the wrought-iron gates, and she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October breeze rustling through the live oak trees. When the doorbell rang, she answered, it to find a man in his 40s with kind eyes and the weathered face of someone who had seen too much of humanity's darker side. "Ma'am, I'm Detective Webb. I need to speak with Mr. Richard Whitmore about some old business that's recently come to light." His voice carried the slow cadence of someone born and raised in the Low Country, but there was an urgency beneath his politeness that made Carmen's stomach clench with foreboding. She led him to Richard's study, where the millionaire was reviewing architectural plans for a new development project along the Savannah River. Richard's face went ashen when he saw the detective's badge. Carmen lingered in the hallway, supposedly dusting the same antique sideboard she had cleaned an hour earlier, but really listening to a conversation that would change everything. "Mr. Whitmore," Detective Webb began, "we've recently arrested Vincent Vinny Torino on federal racketeering charges. During his interrogation, your name came up in connection with some real estate deals from about 8 years ago." The silence that followed was deafening. Carmen could almost hear Richard's heart pounding as he processed the implications. Vincent Torino, she remembered that name from Ethan's recordings, though the child had called him the man with the scar. After what felt like an eternity, Richard's voice emerged as barely more than a whisper. "I don't know what you're talking about, Detective. Mr. Whitmore, I'm going to be straight with you. Torino is facing life in prison, and he's looking to make deals. He's claiming that you helped him launder money through legitimate real estate transactions back in 2016 and 2017. He says he has records, photographs, even audio recordings of your meetings." Detective Webb's voice remained steady, professional. Now, I've looked into your background, sir. You're a pillar of this community. Your foundation has helped hundreds of deaf children, but if Torino's telling the truth—" Carmen heard Richard's chair creak as he shifted, probably running his hands through his silver hair the way he did when he was deeply stressed. "Detective, if I did have any association with Mr. Torino, it was under duress. That man doesn't make requests, he makes demands. And when he demands something from you, you have two choices: comply or disappear." "So you're admitting to the business relationship?" Webb's tone sharpened with interest. Richard's laugh was bitter, hollow. "I'm admitting that when a man like Vincent Torino decides you're going to help him clean his money, you don't get to say no. Especially when you have a wife and a young son who might get hurt if you don't cooperate." Carmen's blood ran cold as she realized the full scope of what Ethan had overheard as a child. Richard continued, his voice heavy with years of suppressed guilt. "I thought I was protecting my family by going along with it. I used my legitimate developments to clean his drug money for about 18 months. I told myself it was temporary, that I'd find a way out. But then my son had his accident and everything changed." "Changed how?" Detective Webb prompted. There was another long pause before Richard answered. "My boy was riding his bike that day because he was upset. He'd been having nightmares, acting strange, seemed terrified of something he couldn't explain. The accident put him in the hospital with severe head trauma, and when he came out of it, he was deaf. Completely deaf." Carmen heard the pain in Richard's voice as he continued. In the strangest way, it was almost a blessing. Ethan couldn't hear the phone calls anymore, couldn't overhear conversations that were giving him nightmares. Torino saw it the same way, said, "A deaf kid wasn't a liability, so he let me out of our arrangement, said my debt was paid, and as long as my son stayed incapacitated, my family would be safe." Detective Webb's next words sent ice through Carmen's veins. "Mr. Whitmore, what if I told you that Vincent Torino still considers your son a potential witness? What if I told you that he's been having you watched all these years, waiting to see if the boy ever recovers his hearing? And what if I told you that now that he's facing life in prison, he's not as concerned about keeping old agreements?" The crash that followed was Richard's coffee mug hitting the hardwood floor. Carmen heard footsteps, probably Richard pacing. "What are you saying, detective?" His voice was strangled with terror. "I'm saying that Torino might decide your son is better off permanently silent. And I'm saying that we need your testimony to put this man away forever before he makes that decision." Carmen felt the world spinning around her. Upstairs, she knew Ethan was in his room, supposedly reading but actually listening to every word of this conversation that would determine his fate. The boy who had chosen silence to protect himself and his family was about to discover that his sacrifice might not be enough, that the monsters he'd been hiding from had never really gone away. "There's something else," Detective Webb continued. "We have reason to believe that Torino has been pressuring other families, other children. Your testimony could save more than just your own son. It could protect dozens of innocent people who are trapped in the same situation you were." Carmen heard Richard's breathing become labored, the sound of a man drowning in choices he'd made years ago. "If I testify," he said slowly, "if I tell you everything I know about Torino's operation, what happens to my family? What happens to my son?" "We put you in witness protection until the trial," Webb replied, "and after Torino is convicted, you'll be free to live your lives without looking over your shoulders. But Mr. Whitmore, time is running out. We have intelligence that suggests Torino's associates are already making moves. They know we're closing in, and they're tying up loose ends." As Carmen stood in that hallway, her heart breaking for a family caught between terrible choices, she realized that the moment of truth had arrived. not just for Richard Whitmore, who had to choose between safety and justice, but for Ethan, whose 7 years of protective silence were about to be tested in ways he never could have imagined, and for herself, a maid who had stumbled into secrets that could save lives or destroy them, depending on what she chose to do with the knowledge burning inside her chest. The conversation in the study was winding down, but Carmen knew this was just the beginning of a crisis that would force everyone in the Whitmore mansion to confront the lies they'd been living and the truths they'd been avoiding. The question now was whether a family built on deception and sacrifice could find the courage to face their demons together, or whether the weight of their secrets would finally crush them all. That evening, the Whitmore family gathered in their living room for what they believed was a routine discussion about Ethan's college applications. Victoria sat on the antique sofa, her perfectly manicured hands trembling as she sorted through brochures from universities with excellent programs for deaf students. Richard paced by the fireplace, his usual commanding presence reduced to nervous energy that even someone who claimed to be deaf could sense. And Ethan sat in his favorite armchair, maintaining his 7-year performance while his world crumbled around him. Carmen watched from the kitchen doorway as Richard cleared his throat and began signing to his son, his movements sharp and agitated. What the family didn't know was that Carmen had been secretly learning sign language for months, driven by her growing suspicions and her need to understand the full scope of the deception surrounding her. As Richard's hands moved, she translated. In her mind, "Son, there might be some changes coming to our family. We might need to go away for a while." Victoria's head snapped up, her blue eyes wide with confusion. "Richard, what are you talking about? Go away where?" Her husband's face was grim as he continued signing to Ethan while speaking to his wife. "There are some old business matters that have resurfaced. We might need to relocate temporarily for everyone's safety." The color drained from Victoria's face. "This is about those men, isn't it? The ones who used to come to the house when Ethan was little." Richard's hands froze mid-sign. In all their years of marriage, Victoria had never directly acknowledged the dangerous associations that had shadowed their early years. They had both pretended that those dark months had been erased by Ethan's accident and their subsequent dedication to charity work. "Victoria," Richard said carefully, "I know we agreed never to discuss—" "Don't." Her voice cut through the air like broken glass. "Don't tell me what we agreed to never discuss. I've spent 7 years pretending that our son's disability was just a tragic accident. I've spent 7 years believing that our guilt was about not protecting him from a truck. But it was never about the truck, was it, Richard?" Carmen felt her heart stop as Victoria continued, her voice rising with years of suppressed knowledge. "It was about protecting him from your business partners. It was about the relief we both felt when he couldn't hear their threats anymore. It was about the fact that our deaf son was finally safe from the monsters you brought into our home." The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan sat perfectly still, maintaining his facade even as his mother's words revealed that she had suspected the truth all along. Richard's face crumpled as he realized that the protective lies he thought he had been telling had been seen through by the woman he loved most. "You knew," he whispered. Victoria's laugh was bitter, broken. "Of course I knew. Do you think I'm stupid, Richard? Do you think I didn't notice that Ethan stopped having nightmares after the accident? Do you think I didn't see the relief in your eyes when the doctor said he was deaf? Do you think I didn't understand why those dangerous men stopped coming to our house the moment our son could no longer hear their conversations?" Carmen watched in horrified fascination as 17 years of marriage and 7 years of careful deception unraveled in real time. But what shocked her most was Ethan's reaction, or rather, his lack of reaction. A truly deaf person would have been confused by the tension in the room, concerned by their parents' obvious distress. Instead, Ethan sat with the stillness of someone listening to every word, processing information that would determine his family's fate. Victoria stood up abruptly, her elegant composure finally shattering. "And you know what the worst part is? The worst part is that I've spent 7 years hating myself for being grateful. Grateful that my son couldn't hear the things that were tearing our family apart. Grateful that his disability meant he was safe from your mistakes. What kind of mother is grateful for her child's suffering? The kind of mother who loves her child enough to sacrifice her own peace of mind for his safety," Richard said quietly. "Victoria, everything I did was to protect our family. Every compromise, every deal, every lie, it was all to keep you and Ethan safe." But Victoria was beyond consolation. "Safe? Richard, a detective, came to our house today asking about Vincent Torino. That man is still out there, still a threat to our son. How is Ethan safe when the monsters from your past are still hunting?" Him. Her voice broke on the last words, and Carmen saw 7 years of carefully controlled terror finally breaking free. That quote S when Carmen made a decision that would change everything. She stepped into the living room, her small frame somehow commanding attention in a way that surprised even her. "Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore," she said quietly, "there's something you both need to know. Something about Ethan that changes everything." 3 pairs of eyes turned to her, Richard's filled with confusion, Victoria's with desperate hope, and Ethan's with a fear so profound it made Carmen's heart ache. She looked directly at the young man who had spent 7 years protecting his family through sacrifice and silence. "Ethan," she said softly, "it's time to tell them the truth." The words hung in the air like a prayer, a challenge, and a benediction all at once. For a moment, nobody moved. Then slowly, Ethan Whitmore did something he hadn't done in front of his parents for 7 years. He spoke. "Mom, Dad." His voice was rusty from disuse, but clear and strong. "I need to tell you something that's going to change everything you think you know about our family." Victoria's gasp echoed through the mansion's high-ceilinged rooms as she realized that the son she had mourned for 7 years had been hiding in plain sight, protecting them all through the most elaborate and heartbreaking deception imaginable. Carmen watched as Richard stumbled backward, his face cycling through shock, confusion, joy, and terror in rapid succession. "You can hear us," he whispered. "You've been able to hear us this whole time." Ethan nodded, tears streaming down his face as 7 years of careful performance finally crumbled. "I chose silence to protect us all," he said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "But Carmen is right. It's time for the truth. All of it." As the family stared at each other across a chasm of deception and love, Carmen realized that the hardest part wasn't over. It was just beginning. Because now they had to figure out how to survive the truth together, and whether their love for each other was strong enough to overcome 7 years of necessary lies. Victoria collapsed onto the sofa as if her legs could no longer support the weight of revelation. Her perfectly composed facade, maintained through 7 years of public appearances and charity galas, crumbled as she looked at her son, truly looked at him for the first time since his supposed accident. "All those doctors," she whispered, her voice breaking, "all those specialists, those treatments, those surgeries we put you through." She covered her face with her hands. "Oh God, Ethan, what did we do to you?" Ethan moved toward his mother, with the fluid grace of someone no longer pretending to navigate by vibration alone. "Mom, you didn't know. I made sure you didn't know. Every medical test, every hearing exam, I fooled them all because I had to. Because staying deaf was the only way to keep our family alive." He knelt beside the sofa, taking his mother's hands in his, Do you remember Dr. Morrison at Children's Hospital? How frustrated he was that the hearing aids never helped? How confused he was that my brain scans didn't match my symptoms? Richard stood frozen by the fireplace, his successful businessman's mind struggling to process the implications. "The foundation," he said slowly. "The Whitmore Foundation for Deaf Children. We've raised millions of dollars, Ethan. We've helped hundreds of families based on—" His voice trailed off as the full scope of their situation became clear. "Based on my lie," Ethan finished. "Dad, I know what this means. I know that when the truth comes out, everything we've built will be questioned. The foundation, your business, reputation, Mom's advocacy work, all of it was built on the story of your deaf son, who overcame tragedy through family love and determination." Carmen watched as the weight of public consequence settled over the family like a shroud. In Savannah's tight-knit society, where reputation was everything and scandal traveled faster than Spanish moss in a hurricane, the revelation would be devastating. But what broke her heart was seeing how Ethan, even now, was more concerned about his parents' pain than his own lost childhood. Victoria suddenly looked up, her tear-stained face fierce with maternal protection. "I don't care about the foundation. I don't care about the money or the reputation or what people will say. Ethan, you gave up your childhood to protect us. You sat through 7 years of silent dinners, missed conversations, pretended not to hear us say we loved you." Her voice cracked completely. "How many times did you want to respond when we talked to you? How many times did you have to stay silent when you wanted to comfort us or tell us you were okay?" The question hung in the air, like incense, heavy with years of unspoken pain. Ethan's composure finally broke, and Carmen saw the 17-year-old. Boy, he really was, beneath the elaborate performance he had maintained for so long. "Every day," he whispered, "every single day, I wanted to tell you that it wasn't your fault. That the accident wasn't because you weren't watching me carefully enough, Dad, or because you were distracted by charity work, Mom. I wanted to tell you that I loved you too when you signed it to me at bedtime. I wanted to laugh at Dad's terrible jokes and ask Mom about her day and have normal conversations about homework and friends and stupid teenage things." Richard moved across the room like a man in a dream, sitting on Ethan's other side. For a moment, the three of them formed a circle, of broken hearts trying to find their way back to each other. "Son," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion, "I need you to understand something. That business with Torino, it's not over. Detective Webb made that clear today. The danger that made you choose silence 7 years ago, it's coming back." Carmen felt a chill as she realized that their moment of truth was about to be tested in the most dangerous way possible. The family was finally healing from 7 years of deception, but the monsters that had created the need for deception were still lurking in the shadows. "I know," Ethan said quietly. "I heard every word of your conversation with Detective Webb. I've been hearing everything, Dad. Every phone call, every late-night meeting, every moment when you thought I was safely locked away in silence. I know that Vincent Torino is in custody. I know that he's threatening to eliminate potential witnesses, and I know that you have to decide whether to testify against him." The silence that followed was profound. Finally, Victoria spoke, her voice steady with newfound resolve. "Then we face it together. No more lies, no more secrets, no more protecting each other through deception. If there are monsters to fight, we fight them as a family. A real family that can hear each other, support each other, and be honest with each other." But Richard's face was etched with worry. "Victoria, you don't understand the kind of people we're dealing with. Torino's associates don't just threaten, they follow through. If they find out that Ethan can hear, that he's been listening to everything all these years—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Carmen stepped forward again, her voice surprisingly strong. "Mr. Whitmore, With respect, you're still thinking like a man who has to face this alone. But you're not alone anymore. You have Detective Webb and the federal authorities. You have your son, who is braver than any of us imagined. And you have Mrs. Whitmore, who has been carrying this burden alongside you for 7 years. She looked at each member of the family in turn. But most importantly, you have the truth now. And the truth, no matter how complicated or dangerous, is always stronger than lies. Ethan proved that by surviving 7 years of deception to protect you. Now it's time for all of you to be brave enough to face the consequences together. As the family sat in their elegant living room, surrounded by the trappings of wealth and success that had been built on foundations of both legitimate achievement and criminal compromise, Carmen realized she was witnessing something remarkable. A family that had been slowly dying from the poison of necessary secrets was finally choosing to live with the dangerous medicine of truth. The question now wasn't whether they could survive the revelation of Ethan's deception. It was whether they could survive the battle that lay ahead, and whether love and honesty would be enough to overcome the darkness that had shadowed their lives for so long. 3 days later, the Whitmore mansion became the epicenter of a carefully orchestrated federal operation. Detective Webb had returned, with a team of U.S. Marshals and FBI agents who transformed the elegant home into a secure facility while they prepared Richard's testimony against Vincent Torino. Carmen watched from the kitchen as men in dark suits installed security equipment and communication devices throughout the house, turning their sanctuary into something that felt more like a fortress under siege. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. After 7 years of Ethan hiding in silence to protect his family from dangerous criminals, those same criminals had finally forced the family into witness protection. But this time, they would face the threat together. With the full weight of federal law enforcement behind them, Ethan had become the key to everything. His childhood recordings, carefully preserved in his grandmother's jewelry box, provided crucial evidence of Torino's early operations. More importantly, his detailed memory of conversations he had overheard provided investigators with information that even Richard had forgotten or never fully understood. The boy who had chosen deafness to become invisible had become the most important witness in a case that could topple an entire criminal organization. "Your son is remarkable," Agent Sarah Chen told Victoria as they watched Ethan work with federal prosecutors in the study. Most adults would have trouble recalling details from conversations they heard 7 years ago. But Ethan remembers everything: names, dates, amounts of money discussed, even the emotional context of what he overheard. His mind preserved those memories like evidence in a vault. Victoria's pride was mixed with heartbreak. He was just a little boy trying to understand why his parents were scared all the time. "I never imagined he was memorizing every detail because he somehow knew it would be important someday." She paused, watching her son through the doorway. "Do you think he's safe now? Really safe?" Agent Chen's expression was serious. "Ma'am, I won't lie to you. Vincent Torino has connections that reach far beyond what we've uncovered. Even from prison, he's been orchestrating activities through his associates. But your son's testimony, combined with your husband's cooperation and the physical evidence we've gathered, will put him away forever. After that, his organization will fragment. The threat will be neutralized." But Carmen noticed something that the federal agents missed: a black sedan that had been parked across the street for 3 consecutive days, its occupants changing shifts but always maintaining visual contact with the mansion. She mentioned it to Detective Webb, who immediately called for additional security sweeps of the neighborhood. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Patterson, the family's longtime housekeeper, had been quietly documenting suspicious activities around the estate for months. Her detailed notes about unfamiliar vehicles, strange phone calls, and unusual maintenance requests revealed a pattern of surveillance that had been going on far longer than anyone realized. "They've been watching us," Mrs. Patterson told the investigators, her voice steady despite the implications. "Ever since that boy's accident, there's been someone keeping an eye on this family. I thought it was just Mr. Richard being paranoid after what happened, but now I see they were making sure the witness stayed incapacitated." The revelation sent shockwaves through the federal team. Torino hadn't simply accepted Ethan's deafness and moved on. He had been monitoring the family for 7 years, waiting to see if the boy would ever recover his hearing. Every doctor's appointment, every therapy session, every public appearance where Ethan demonstrated his disability had been observed and reported back to the criminal organization. "It means they know," Agent Chen said grimly. "If they've been watching this closely, they've seen the changes in the family's behavior over the past week. They know something is different." The implication hung in the air like a storm cloud. Torino's associates might already suspect that their supposedly deaf witness could actually hear everything. That evening, as the family gathered for what might be their last dinner in the mansion before entering witness protection, Carmen served a meal that felt like a farewell. The federal agents maintained their perimeter, but everyone could feel the tension building like humidity before a thunderstorm. It was Ethan who broke the silence. "I want to say something before we leave this house," he announced, his voice carrying a maturity that seemed far beyond his 17 years. "For 7 years, I've been silent at this table. I've watched you both blame yourselves for things that weren't your fault. I've seen you sacrifice your happiness because you thought I couldn't hear your love, your worry, your hope for my future." He looked at each of his parents in turn. "But I heard everything. Every bedtime story Mom read to me, even though she thought I couldn't process the words. Every time Dad played piano in the music room, hoping the vibrations might somehow reach me. Every prayer you whispered when you thought I was sleeping, asking God to give me back what you thought I had lost." Victoria was crying openly now, but they were tears of healing rather than grief. "We love you so much, sweetheart. We always have." Ethan smiled, and Carmen saw in that expression the joy of a young man finally free to be himself with the people who mattered most. "I know," he said simply. "I always knew. That's what kept me strong through all the silence, knowing that even though I couldn't respond, your love was reaching me. And now, finally, I can tell you that I love you too. I've always loved you, too." But their moment of family reconciliation was interrupted by Agent Chen's urgent voice from her radio. "We have movement. Multiple vehicles approaching from different directions. This is not a drill." Carmen felt her heart stop as the reality of their situation crashed back down around them. The monsters from their past had finally decided that 7 years of watching and waiting was enough. The battle for the Whitmore family's freedom was about to begin, and this time there would be nowhere to hide in silence. The mansion erupted into controlled chaos as federal agents moved with practiced precision through corridors that had once echoed with childhood laughter and family dinners. Carmen found herself swept along with the Whitmore family toward the reinforced safe room that had been established in Richard's study, her heart pounding as she realized that all their careful planning was about to be tested by men who played by no rules except violence. "Stay low, stay together, and do exactly what the agents tell you," Detective Webb instructed as he ushered them down the hallway. Through the windows, Carmen could see dark figures moving through the grounds, their movements coordinated and purposeful. These weren't random criminals. They were professionals who had been planning this assault for days, maybe weeks. Agent Chen's voice crackled through the communication system. "We have at least 6 hostiles, possibly more." They're using the oak trees for cover and approaching from 3 different angles. This is a tactical extraction. They want the family alive." Her words sent ice through Carmen's veins. Alive meant they could be used as leverage, as bargaining chips or worse, as examples to other potential witnesses. In the study-turned-safe room, Ethan surprised everyone by taking charge with a calm authority that seemed to come from his years of silent observation. "Agent Chen," he called through the radio system. "The man leading them will be Tommy Castellano. He's Torino's nephew. I remember him from when I was 10. He has a distinctive scar across his left hand from a knife fight, and he walks with a slight limp from an old gunshot wound. He's the one Torino trusted with the most sensitive operations." Victoria stared at her son in amazement. "How do you remember all that?" Ethan's smile was grim. "Mom, when you spend 7 years pretending to be deaf, you learn to notice everything about the people around you. Every detail becomes important because you never know what might save your life someday." The first explosion shattered the mansion's front windows, and Carmen instinctively pulled Victoria closer as plaster dust rained down from the ceiling. Richard was on his phone with the FBI coordinator, his businessman's composure finally cracking under the pressure. "How long until backup arrives?" he shouted over the sound of gunfire erupting outside. 10 minutes, came the response. "Hold your position and trust your security team." But 10 minutes felt like an eternity when men with automatic weapons were systematically dismantling the barriers between them and their targets. Mrs. Patterson, who had refused to leave despite the danger, surprised everyone by revealing another secret she had been keeping. "Mr. Richard," she said calmly, "there's something about this house you don't know. Your grandfather had tunnels built during Prohibition, tunnels that connect to the old carriage house and the property next door. I've been maintaining them for 40 years, just in case." Agent Chen's voice cut through their planning. "Safe. A room compromised. They're using explosive charges on the study door. We need alternate extraction." Mrs. Patterson was already moving, pulling back a bookshelf to reveal a hidden passage that looked like something from a Gothic novel. "This way," she said with the authority of someone who had been preparing for this moment her entire life. As they moved through the narrow tunnel, lit only by emergency flashlights, Carmen found herself next to Ethan, who was helping his mother navigate the uneven stone floor. "Are you scared?" she whispered. His answer surprised her with its maturity. "I've been scared for 7 years, Carmen, but for the first time I'm scared for the right reasons. I'm scared of losing the family I just got back, not of them discovering secrets I've been hiding." The seed tunnel led to the old carriage house, where Detective Webb and 2 federal agents were waiting with armored vehicles. But as they emerged from the underground passage, Carmen realized that Torino's men had anticipated this escape route. Tommy Castellano stood in the doorway, his scarred hand holding a pistol that seemed enormous in the confined space. Well, he said, his voice carrying a thick Brooklyn accent that seemed out of place in the genteel southern setting. "The famous deaf kid who's been causing so much trouble. You know, Ethan, my uncle always wondered if you were really as damaged as everyone claimed. Guess we're about to find out." But Ethan did something that no one expected. He smiled. "Hello, Tommy," he said clearly, his voice carrying no trace of fear. "I remember you. You used to bring my father envelopes full of dirty money, and you always smelled like cheap cologne and desperation. I also remember that you're left-handed, which means you're holding that gun in the wrong hand, if you want to be accurate." Castellano's eyes widened with shock at being addressed directly by someone he had believed was deaf for 7 years. In that moment of surprise, Detective Webb moved with lightning precision, disarming the criminal while federal agents swarmed the carriage house from multiple entrances. As Castellano was dragged away in handcuffs, shouting threats and profanities. He turned back one last time. "This isn't over, kid. You think testifying against my uncle is going to make you safe? We've got long memories, and we don't forgive, and we don't forget." But Ethan's response surprised everyone in its quiet strength. "Tommy, I've spent 7 years in silence, listening to the consequences of fear and lies. I'm not afraid of your threats anymore, because I finally understand that the only thing more dangerous than the truth is living a lie, and I'm done living lies." As federal agents secured the property and ambulances arrived to treat the wounded, Carmen watched the Whitmore family standing together in the morning sunlight that filtered through the Spanish moss. They were no longer the broken, guilt-ridden people she had served for 2 decades. They were a family reborn through honesty, tested by danger, and strengthened by the knowledge that love could survive even the most elaborate deceptions. But the most profound transformation was in Ethan himself. No longer the frightened child, hiding in protective silence, but a young man who had found his voice and the courage to use it for truth, justice, and the protection of the family he had sacrificed so much to save. 6 months later, the federal courthouse in Atlanta buzzed with media attention as the Vincent Torino trial reached its dramatic conclusion. Carmen sat in the witness gallery, watching as Ethan took the stand with a confidence that would have been unimaginable a year earlier. His testimony had been the cornerstone of the prosecution's case, detailed, precise, and devastating to Torino's defense. The courtroom fell silent as Ethan described, in his clear, strong voice, the conversations he had overheard as a frightened 9-year-old. He spoke of money laundering schemes, threats against his family, and the systematic intimidation that had driven him to choose 7 years of silence as his only protection. When the defense attorney tried to discredit his memory, suggesting that a child couldn't have understood such complex criminal activities, Ethan's response was both heartbreaking and powerful. "Your Honor," he said, looking directly at Vincent Torino, "when you're a little boy lying awake at night listening to men threaten to hurt your parents, you remember every word. Fear has a way of making even children very good listeners." The jury's faces reflected the impact of his words, and Carmen saw several jurors wiping away tears. Vincent Torino, the man who had cast such a long shadow over the Whitmore families. Life looked smaller and more pathetic than Carmen had ever imagined. Gone was the intimidating figure from Ethan's childhood recordings. In his place sat an aging criminal facing multiple life sentences, his empire crumbling around him as witness after witness testified to his decades of violence and corruption. When the guilty verdict was read on all 37 counts, including racketeering, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit murder, Carmen watched Torino's face crumple with the realization that he would die in prison. But more importantly, she watched the Whitmore family finally exhale. After holding their breath for 7 years, outside the courthouse, Richard addressed the media with a statement that had been carefully prepared but delivered from the heart. "My family has learned that the truth, no matter how painful or complicated, is always more powerful than lies. My son Ethan showed incredible courage in choosing to protect our family, and even greater courage in choosing to help bring Vincent Torino to justice." The revelation of Ethan's deception had indeed created a scandal, just as they had feared. The Whitmore Foundation for Deaf Children faced intense scrutiny, with critics questioning whether funds had been raised under false pretenses. But something unexpected happened. Instead of abandoning the family, the deaf community and their supporters rallied around them. Dr. Amanda Foster, a prominent deaf advocate from the Georgia Association for the Deaf, spoke at a packed press conference. "The Whitmore Foundation has helped hundreds of deaf children, regardless of the personal circumstances that created it. Ethan Whitmore's story doesn't diminish the real struggles of deaf children. It highlights the extraordinary lengths some families go to protect each other. The Foundation's work speaks for itself. More surprisingly, donations to the Foundation increased dramatically as people learned the full story. Richard announced that he would be restructuring the organization to focus on children from families affected by crime and violence, with Ethan serving as a youth advocate and public speaker. Victoria had found her own path to redemption. She enrolled in law school at 45, determined to become a victims' rights attorney specializing in witness protection cases. "I've spent 7 years advocating for one cause," she told Carmen over coffee in their restored kitchen. "Now, I want to advocate for families who are trapped by circumstances beyond their control, just like we were." Mrs. Patterson had become something of a local celebrity after her role in the family's escape was revealed. The Historical Society was fascinated by the Prohibition-era tunnels she had maintained, and she found herself giving tours to visitors who wanted to hear about the mansion's hidden history. Turns out keeping secrets for 40 years was good practice for keeping the ones that really mattered, she told Carmen with a wry smile. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation was in Ethan himself. At 18, he had deferred college for a year to work with federal prosecutors on related cases, helping to identify other families who might be trapped by criminal organizations. His unique perspective, someone who had survived by pretending to be powerless while secretly gathering information, made him invaluable in understanding how criminals might target and manipulate families. "The thing about pretending to be deaf," he told Carmen one evening as they walked through Forsyth Park, "is that it taught me how to really listen. Not just to words, but to the emotions behind them, the fear, the love, the desperation. I want to use that skill to help other families find their voices before they have to choose silence like I did." The family had moved back into the mansion after extensive security renovations, but the house felt completely different now. Gone was the oppressive weight of secrets and guilt. In its place was something Carmen had never experienced in all her years of service, the sound of genuine laughter, animated conversation, and a teenage boy who could finally be himself. Richard and Victoria's marriage, which had been slowly dying under the weight of unspoken truths, experienced its own rebirth. They enrolled in couples counseling and began having the honest conversations they had avoided for years. "We spent so much time protecting each other from pain that we forgot how to share joy," Victoria told Carmen. "We're learning how to be happy together again." The most touching moment came on a quiet Sunday evening in December, exactly 1 year after the truth had first come out. The family was decorating their Christmas tree, something they had done in relative silence for 7 years, communicating only through signs and gestures. Now the house was filled with Ethan's voice as he shared memories from Christmases past, stories he had been unable to tell, feelings he had been forced to keep hidden. "You know what I missed most?" he asked as he hung an ornament his grandmother had given him years ago. "I missed being able to tell you both that I could hear the Christmas music playing. I missed being able to say that Mom's voice reading the Christmas story was the most beautiful sound in the world. I missed being able to thank Dad for playing Christmas carols on the piano, even though he thought I couldn't hear them." As Carmen watched this family that had been broken by necessary deceptions finally whole again through dangerous truths, she realized she had witnessed something profound. The power of love to survive even the most elaborate lies, and the courage it takes to choose honesty when the stakes are life and death. The Whitmore family story had become a testament to the idea that sometimes the greatest act of love is the willingness to live with painful truths rather than comfortable lies, and that redemption is always possible for those brave enough to face the consequences of their choices. 2 years had passed since the truth had shattered and rebuilt the Whitmore family. and Carmen stood in the same library where she had first heard Ethan humming that fateful morning. But now the room was filled with a different energy. The sound of Ethan practicing a speech he would give at the National Conference on Child Witnesses, his voice strong and confident as he rehearsed words that would inspire other young people. Trapped in impossible situations. The mansion had become more than a family home. It was now a beacon of hope for families facing similar crises. The newly renamed Whitmore Foundation for Vulnerable Families had established a residential program in the estate's guest wing, providing temporary sanctuary for children and their families who needed protection while testifying against dangerous criminals. Mrs. Patterson had become the program's residential director, her decades of secret-keeping now channeled into protecting families who needed someone who understood the weight of dangerous knowledge. Victoria had graduated from law school with honors and opened her own practice specializing in witness protection advocacy. Her first major case had been representing a family from Birmingham whose teenage daughter had witnessed a drug cartel murder. When the girl's family was threatened into silence, Victoria used her own experience to help them find the courage to cooperate with federal authorities. "I know what it feels like to watch your child sacrifice their childhood to keep the family safe," she had told the terrified parents. "But I also know that silence isn't always protection. Sometimes it's just delayed justice." Richard's business empire had actually grown stronger after the scandal, as investors and partners gained new respect for a man who had chosen truth over reputation. His development projects now included affordable housing for witness protection, families and community centers designed with security features that could serve as temporary safe havens. Building structures to protect people is more satisfying than just building structures to make money, he had told a business magazine interviewer. But the most profound transformation was still in Ethan himself. At 20, he had become one of the youngest advocates ever appointed to the Federal Witness Protection Advisory Board. His unique perspective, someone who had created his own protection by choosing disability, made him invaluable in developing programs for children who found themselves trapped between family loyalty and moral obligation. Carmen watched him now as he spoke with a group of teenage witnesses who had come to the mansion for a weekend retreat. His voice carried the authority of someone who truly understood their fear. "I know what it's like to feel like you have to choose between protecting your family and doing what's right. I know what it's like to feel like you're carrying secrets too big for your shoulders, but I learned something important. Sometimes the best way to protect the people you love is to trust them with the truth." One of the teenagers, a girl about 15, whose family was being threatened by gang members in Chicago, looked up at Ethan with desperate hope. "But what if telling the truth makes everything worse? What if your family gets hurt because you couldn't keep quiet?" Ethan's response came from the depths of his hard-won wisdom. "The question isn't whether truth is dangerous. It is. The question is whether lies are more dangerous. In my experience, secrets have a way of growing in the dark until they become more threatening than the truth ever could be." As the afternoon sun slanted through the windows, Carmen reflected on her own journey through this extraordinary story. She had discovered that being a maid in the Whitmore household had made her much more than a servant. She had become a guardian of secrets, a catalyst for truth, and ultimately a witness to one of the most remarkable family transformations she had ever seen. The evening brought a special celebration. The 5th anniversary of the Vincent Torino conviction and the 2nd anniversary of Ethan's first public speech about his experience. The family gathered in the dining room, where they had shared so many silent meals, but now the table was filled with conversation, laughter, and the easy communication of people who had learned to trust each other completely. Mrs. Patterson emerged from the kitchen carrying a cake she had decorated with musical notes, a tribute to all the sounds Ethan had pretended not to hear during his years of protective silence. "Make a wish, dear," she told him with the affection of someone who had helped raise him through his most difficult years. As Ethan closed his eyes to make his wish, Carmen knew without being told what he was hoping for, not for his own happiness, which he had already found, but for the courage and strength of all the children who were still trapped in silence, still afraid to speak truth to power, still sacrificing their voices to protect the people they loved. When he opened his eyes and blew out the candles, his first words were characteristic of the man he had become. "I wish for a world where children never have to choose between their safety and their honesty, where families can face their problems together instead of protecting each other through deception, and where love is strong enough to survive any truth." Victoria raised her glass in a toast. To Ethan, who taught us that sometimes the greatest courage is not the willingness to fight, but the willingness to listen. And to Carmen, who saw what we couldn't see and gave us the push we needed to face the truth together. Carmen felt tears in her eyes as the family she had served for so many years finally acknowledged her role in their healing. But the most powerful moment came when Richard stood to speak, his voice filled with emotion. 7 years ago, I thought I had lost my son to an accident. 2 years ago, I learned that I had never lost him at all. He had been there all along, listening, loving, and protecting us in ways we never could have imagined. Today, I know that the accident wasn't what took my son away from me. Fear was what took my son away from me, and love, honest, brave, dangerous love, was what brought him back. As the celebration continued into the evening, Carmen stepped out onto the mansion's wraparound porch, where Spanish moss still whispered secrets through the wrought iron railings. But now those secrets were different. They were stories of hope, rather than fear, of families healing rather than hiding, of children finding their voices instead of losing them. The sound of Ethan's laughter drifted through the open doors, joined by his parents' voices and Mrs. Patterson's gentle chuckles. It was the sound of a family that had learned the hardest lesson of all, that truth, no matter how dangerous or painful, was always more powerful than the most elaborate lies, and that love, when it's strong enough to survive honesty, becomes unbreakable. I'm John Parker, and remember, every story hides a truth. But sometimes the most beautiful truth is that love can survive any secret, overcome any deception, and heal any wound, if we're brave enough to choose honesty over comfort and trust over fear. Thank you for listening to this story of the Whitmore family, whose journey from silence to truth reminds us that even in our darkest moments, redemption is possible, and families can find their way back to each other. Please let us know in the comments where you're listening from. Your voices help us reach families around the world who might need to hear that they're not alone. Subscribe to Invisible Hearts, because every story we share might be exactly what someone needs to hear to find their own courage to face the truth.